There comes a moment in life when time no longer rushes forward but begins to look back at you. The noise of ambition softens, the hunger to prove fades. What remains is a quiet question that grows louder with each passing year. Was my life inwardly meaningful? Old age is not merely the decline of the body. It is the final psychological landscape in which a person must live with themselves. And it is here that four invisible pillars quietly determine whether the later years become bitter, anxious, and regretful, or calm, dignified, and deeply fulfilled. The first pillar is moral autonomy. A life governed only by external rewards collapses in old age because applause fades and titles lose their power. What endures is the knowledge that you lived according to an inner law. When a person acts not from fear, imitation, or blind obedience, but from a sense of inner responsibility, something remarkable happens. Conscience becomes a companion rather than an accuser. In youth, morality often feels like restriction. In old age, it becomes shelter. Those who betrayed themselves repeatedly feel haunted by their own memories. Those who honored their inner voice experience a rare peace, the peace of having been aligned with themselves. Autonomy is not rebellion against the world. It is loyalty to the deepest structure of the psyche. The second pillar is dignity beyond usefulness. Modern life trains us to measure worth through productivity. But aging exposes the lie in this belief. When strength weakens and speed slows, those who tied their identity to usefulness feel discarded by life itself. A wiser, psychological stance understands dignity as inherent, not earned. The elderly person who knows this does not feel humiliated by dependency or change. They do not beg life for validation. They stand quietly, knowing their value does not decrease with their efficiency. This inner dignity transforms aging from humiliation into initiation. The body may bend, but the soul stands upright. Without this pillar, old age becomes a constant defense against shame. With it, aging becomes a state of quiet authority. The third pillar is acceptance of limits. Youth lives under the illusion of endless possibility. Old age shatters this illusion, and that shattering can either destroy the psyche or mature it. Those who rage against finitude grow bitter. Those who accept limitation grow wise. Psychological health in later life depends not on denial, but on reconciliation with boundaries. The boundary of time, of strength, of control. Acceptance is not surrender to meaninglessness. It is surrender to reality. When limits are accepted, energy is no longer wasted fighting what cannot be changed. That freed energy turns inward, toward reflection, understanding, and integration. Old age then becomes less about loss and more about distillation. Life reduced to what truly matters. The fourth pillar is responsibility to future consciousness. A fulfilled old age does not close inward selfishly. It turns outward symbolically. The question shifts from what did I gain to what did I carry forward. Even without children, legacy lives in values transmitted, truths spoken, integrity demonstrated. The elderly person who feels connected to something beyond their lifespan does not fear disappearance. Their psyche is anchored in continuity. They become less obsessed with personal survival and more attuned to meaning itself. This responsibility is not about control over the future, but care for it. It grants old age a sense of purpose that outlives the body. When these four pillars are absent, aging becomes terrifying. The psyche fills with regret, resentment, and fear of judgment, both internal and imagined. But when these pillars are lived, something subtle occurs. Time stops feeling like an enemy. Memory stops being a battlefield. Silence stops being empty. Old age then becomes a psychological crown rather than a punishment. Happiness in later life is not pleasure. It is coherence. It is the feeling that one's inner world makes sense, that contradictions have been faced rather than avoided, that the self has been lived rather than performed. Such happiness is quiet, almost invisible to others, but profoundly real to the one who possesses it. Old age does not reward those who chased happiness. It rewards those who built foundations strong enough to carry the weight of reflection. And when the outer world grows dim, these inner pillars remain, holding the soul upright in the final chapter of life. Moral autonomy begins as a quiet inner tension long before it becomes a conscious principle. It appears whenever a person senses a gap between what is expected of them and what feels inwardly right. In early life, this tension is often ignored because belonging feels safer than integrity. The psyche learns quickly that approval brings comfort, while disobedience brings risk. Over time, many people mistake adaptation for authenticity and forget that obedience, when unexamined, slowly erodes the self. Moral autonomy is not loud rebellion or dramatic resistance. It is the slow construction of an inner axis around which the personality can turn without collapsing. It is the ability to say yes or no from a place deeper than fear or desire for reward. When actions are guided only by external authority, social norms, tradition, popularity, power, the inner world becomes fragmented. One part of the psyche acts, another observes, and a third silently judges. This inner division may not cause immediate pain, but it accumulates quietly. In youth, distraction hides it. In midlife, busyness masks it. In old age, when silence grows and reflection deepens, the divided psyche becomes restless. Memories return not as neutral images, but as moral echoes. Each compromised decision asks to be accounted for. Moral autonomy prevents this inner reckoning from becoming torment, because the person has already lived in dialogue with their conscience. To live autonomously is to recognize that responsibility cannot be outsourced. Blaming parents, society, circumstances, or fate may soothe the ego temporarily, but it weakens the soul. The autonomous individual understands that even under pressure, a choice remains, and that choice shapes the inner world more than the outer outcome ever could. This recognition is heavy, but it is also liberating. It replaces helplessness with authorship. The psyche no longer feels like a victim of life, but a participant in its own becoming. Such participation builds inner solidity, a quality that becomes invaluable when external structures fall away with age. Moral autonomy also reshapes the relationship with guilt. Instead of being an overwhelming, vague burden, guilt becomes precise and instructive. When a person violates their own inner law, the psyche responds clearly, not with confusion but with direction. This clarity allows for correction, growth, and integration. Those who live without autonomy experience guilt as anxiety, shame, or resentment toward others. Those who live with it experience guilt as a signal, not a sentence. Over decades, this difference accumulates into radically different inner landscapes. One becomes cluttered with unresolved self-betrayals. The other remains relatively clean, even when mistakes were made. In old age, moral autonomy reveals its deepest gift: peace with memory. Memory is not neutral storage. It is a living psychological force. It replays not what happened, but what mattered. People who lived according to borrowed values often find their memories accusing them, highlighting moments when they acted against themselves. The autonomous individual also remembers failures, but these memories are held within a larger context of sincerity. There is less need for denial, justification, or revision. The past feels owned rather than endured. This ownership allows reflection without collapse and honesty without despair. Autonomy does not mean isolation from others. On the contrary, it allows for deeper connection. When a person acts from inner conviction rather than conformity, their relationships become more authentic. They do not need to perform roles endlessly or maintain false images. Over time, this authenticity attracts fewer but more meaningful bonds. In later life, when social circles naturally shrink, this quality becomes crucial. The autonomous elder is not haunted by superficial connections lost, but nourished by a few relationships rooted in truth. Loneliness, when it appears, feels spacious rather than empty. There is also a spiritual dimension to moral autonomy that emerges with age. As belief systems, ideologies, and certainties weaken, the autonomous person does not panic. They have never relied entirely on external doctrine for meaning. Their morality has been lived, tested, and embodied. This lived morality becomes a kind of inner compass when metaphysical questions intensify near the end of life. Instead of clinging desperately to answers, the psyche rests in alignment. The question shifts from, "Was I right?" to, "Was I true?" And this question is easier to live with. Without moral autonomy, old age often becomes defensive. The individual clings to rigid opinions, nostalgia, or moral superiority to protect a fragile inner core. Judgment of others intensifies because self-judgment is unbearable. With autonomy, rigidity softens. The person can tolerate ambiguity without losing themselves. They can listen without needing to dominate. They can admit uncertainty without humiliation. This psychological flexibility keeps the inner world alive even as the outer world narrows. Moral autonomy also alters the experience of dependency, which inevitably increases with age. Those who define themselves through obedience or usefulness feel humiliated when they must rely on others. The autonomous individual, having derived worth from inner alignment rather than external validation, experiences dependency without self-contempt. They can receive help without feeling erased. Their identity was never built solely on control or approval, so its loss does not feel like annihilation. Over a lifetime, autonomy requires courage because it often demands standing alone internally even when surrounded by others. But this solitude is not emptiness, it is coherence, and coherence, more than pleasure or success, is what the psyche longs for when time becomes visible. The body may weaken, the world may grow smaller, but the inner law remains intact, offering structure where everything else dissolves, allowing the individual to inhabit their final years without inner collapse, without fleeing from silence, without bargaining with memory, without fearing the quiet presence of themselves. Inherent dignity is not something acquired through achievement, recognition, or usefulness. It exists prior to all performance, yet the psyche is rarely taught to experience itself this way. From early life, value becomes conditional. Praise follows success, attention follows productivity, and love often appears tied to behavior. Slowly, the inner world learns a dangerous equation. To be valuable is to be useful. This belief may serve ambition in youth, but it becomes a psychological trap as time progresses. Aging exposes the fragility of conditional worth because the very capacities that once justified existence begin to fade. When usefulness declines, the question of dignity becomes unavoidable. A psyche trained to depend on function for self-respect experiences aging as a form of erasure. Each physical limitation feels like a subtraction of value. Each moment of dependency feels like a quiet humiliation. This is not because dependency is inherently degrading, but because the inner image of the self was built on being needed rather than being. Inherent dignity challenges this image at its root. It asks the individual to recognize worth that does not fluctuate with strength, speed, or relevance. This recognition is not intellectual, it must be felt, embodied, and lived long before old age arrives, otherwise the psyche resists it as an unbearable loss of identity. In later life, when external affirmation diminishes, inherent dignity becomes an inner posture. It is visible in how a person sits, speaks, and relates to silence. The dignified elder does not rush to justify their existence. They do not apologize for taking up space. They do not compete with the young or cling to outdated authority. Their presence is calm because it does not demand validation. This calm is not indifference. It is self-respect freed from performance. Others may not always notice it, but they feel it instinctively. It creates a subtle boundary that protects the psyche from shame. Shame is the greatest enemy of old age. It creeps in quietly through comparison, dependency, and invisibility. When dignity is external, shame grows easily. When dignity is inherent, shame loses its grip. The individual can acknowledge weakness without self-contempt. They can accept help without feeling diminished. They can withdraw from roles without feeling erased. This internal freedom changes the emotional tone of aging from defensiveness to openness. The person no longer needs to prove that they still matter. They know that they do. Inherent dignity also reshapes memory. Those who measured themselves by usefulness often revisit their past obsessively, highlighting achievements as proof of worth. When achievements no longer protect the ego, memories become trophies clutched tightly, or wounds reopened endlessly. In contrast, when dignity is inherent, memory becomes reflective rather than defensive. The past can be examined without needing to extract validation from it. Failures can be remembered without collapsing into shame, and successes can be remembered without inflation. The psyche remains balanced because worth was never located in outcomes alone. This pillar also transforms the relationship with the body. The aging body inevitably changes in ways that cannot be controlled. When identity is fused with physical competence, these changes feel like betrayal. When dignity is inherent, the body is allowed to age without becoming an enemy. Limitations are acknowledged without being moralized. The individual does not interpret decline as punishment or personal failure. This attitude reduces inner violence, the quiet hostility people often direct toward their own bodies. In its place emerges a form of respect, not admiration, but acceptance rooted in dignity rather than denial. Social relationships in old age are also shaped by this inner stance. Those who depend on usefulness for dignity often manipulate relationships unconsciously, offering advice, control, or sacrifice in exchange for relevance. When these strategies fail, resentment follows. The dignified individual does not need to bargain for belonging. They can be present without imposing. They can listen without needing to lead. This makes their relationships lighter and more genuine. Even solitude, when it occurs, does not feel like abandonment, but like a natural rhythm of life. Inherent dignity is deeply connected to the ability to tolerate invisibility. Modern culture fears invisibility because it equates being seen with being real. Old age often brings a form of social transparency, where the individual feels looked past rather than at. For those without inner dignity, this feels like annihilation. For those who have cultivated it, invisibility becomes a kind of relief. The pressure to perform dissolves. The psyche no longer needs to mirror itself through others' eyes to feel real. Reality is experienced inwardly, directly, without constant reflection. This pillar also protects against bitterness. Bitterness often arises when the psyche feels cheated, when effort is not rewarded with recognition or gratitude. If dignity depends on acknowledgement, aging almost guarantees bitterness. If dignity is inherent, gratitude is welcomed but not required. The individual can give without expecting repayment and receive without humiliation. This emotional independence softens the later years and prevents the hardening of personality that often masquerades as wisdom, but is actually wounded pride. Inherent dignity does not make a person passive, it makes them selective. Actions are no longer driven by the need to prove worth but by genuine interest and inner alignment. In old age, this selectivity becomes essential. Energy is limited, and where it is invested matters deeply. The dignified elder chooses depth over breadth, presence over performance, meaning over noise. Their life may appear smaller from the outside, but it feels fuller from within. As life slows, moments of quiet increase. Without inherent dignity, these moments are filled with anxiety, comparison, and regret. With it, silence becomes inhabitable. The individual can sit with themselves without needing distraction. They do not experience existence as a problem to be solved, but as a reality to be lived. This ability to be with oneself without judgment or demand is perhaps the most reliable indicator of dignity lived rather than claimed, and it is this lived dignity that allows the psyche to remain intact, calm, and self-respecting as the external structures of life gradually fall away. Acceptance of limits is one of the most difficult psychological achievements of a lifetime because it directly contradicts the fantasy that sustains early ambition. In youth, the psyche survives on expansion. It believes in endless growth, infinite correction, and permanent control. This belief is not entirely false at the beginning of life, but it becomes dangerous when carried forward unchanged. Aging confronts the individual with boundaries that cannot be negotiated. Strength diminishes, time contracts, and certain possibilities close forever. The way the psyche responds to this confrontation determines whether old age becomes a period of wisdom or a season of quiet despair. Resistance to limitation often disguises itself as optimism. The individual insists that decline is temporary, that effort will restore what time has taken, that acceptance is surrender. But beneath this attitude lies fear. Fear of helplessness, fear of irrelevance, fear of death. The psyche clings to control because it equates limitation with annihilation. This inner struggle exhausts emotional energy and turns the later years into a constant battle against reality. Acceptance of limits is not passive resignation. It is the recognition that fighting what cannot be changed only deepens suffering. When limits are accepted, something subtle but profound occurs. The psyche stops wasting energy on denial and redirection. Attention turns inward, not in self-obsession, but in reflection. The individual begins to ask different questions, no longer focused on how to expand, but on how to integrate. Life is no longer about accumulation, but about coherence. Experiences are revisited not to relive them, but to understand them. This reflective stance gives old age its distinctive psychological depth. The inability to accept limits often results in bitterness. The individual feels cheated by time, betrayed by the body, and abandoned by opportunity. This bitterness hardens into judgment of the young, of society, of fate itself. Such judgment is a defense against grief. Acceptance allows grief to be felt rather than projected. Grief acknowledged does not destroy the psyche, it refines it. It makes room for compassion, both toward oneself and others. The person who has mourned their losses inwardly no longer needs to resent the world for continuing without them. Limits also redefine freedom. When freedom is understood only as the ability to do anything, limitation feels like imprisonment. But psychological freedom does not depend on endless options. It depends on meaningful choice within reality. Acceptance of limits clarifies what still lies within one's power: attention, attitude, interpretation, and care. These inner freedoms remain intact even as external freedoms diminish. The elderly person who understands this does not feel trapped in their circumstances. They experience agency where it still exists and peace where it does not. There is a profound humility that emerges from accepting limits, and humility is often misunderstood as weakness. In truth, it is accuracy. It is the psyche aligning itself with reality rather than fantasy. This alignment reduces inner conflict. The individual no longer needs to inflate or defend themselves. They can acknowledge dependence without humiliation and competence without arrogance. Such balance stabilizes the personality and prevents the emotional extremes that often accompany aging. Acceptance of limits also transforms time itself. When the future was perceived as vast, time felt abundant. When it contracts, time becomes precious. Those who resist this contraction panic, trying to reclaim speed and volume. Those who accept it slow down. They begin to inhabit moments more fully. Attention deepens. Small experiences light through a window, a familiar voice, a remembered thought, gain weight. This intensification of presence is one of the hidden gifts of aging, but it only becomes accessible when the psyche stops rushing toward what is no longer possible. The body is the most visible teacher of limits and also the most resisted. Many individuals treat bodily decline as a personal failure, responding with anger or neglect. Acceptance changes this relationship. The body is no longer an adversary, but a messenger. Pain becomes information rather than punishment. Fatigue becomes a signal rather than an obstacle. This respectful listening reduces inner violence and creates a quieter coexistence between mind and body. The psyche no longer demands what the body cannot give, and the body no longer becomes a constant source of disappointment. Social roles also narrow with age. Positions of authority, productivity, and visibility often recede. Without acceptance, this loss feels like erasure. With acceptance, it feels like transition. The individual shifts from influence through power to influence through presence. Words become fewer but more weighted. Silence becomes communicative. The person is no longer defined by function, but by being. This shift cannot occur if the psyche remains attached to former identities. Acceptance loosens these attachments without denying their past importance. Fear of death often intensifies when limits are resisted. The psyche interprets every loss as a rehearsal for annihilation. Acceptance reframes death not as sudden theft, but as the final boundary in a series of boundaries already encountered. Each accepted limit prepares the psyche for the next. This gradual preparation does not eliminate fear, but it prevents panic. Death becomes thinkable, speakable, and therefore less overwhelming. The individual can live closer to the truth of finitude without being paralyzed by it. Acceptance of limits also restores a sense of proportion. Many anxieties lose their urgency when the psyche recognizes that not everything can or must be controlled. Conflicts soften, obsessions weaken. The individual becomes more discerning about where to invest emotional energy. This discernment protects the inner world from exhaustion. Old age then becomes less crowded with unnecessary struggles and more focused on what genuinely matters. There is a quiet dignity in accepting what cannot be changed. It does not announce itself or demand admiration. It is visible only in the steadiness of the person who no longer fights life as it is. This steadiness creates inner space, and in that space, understanding grows. The individual no longer measures life by what was lost, but by what was learned, no longer by what could have been, but by what has been lived, allowing the psyche to settle into a state of realism that is neither cynical nor naive, but deeply grounded in truth. Responsibility to the future emerges when the psyche no longer orbits exclusively around personal survival. In early life, attention is naturally drawn toward self-construction, identity, security, achievement, and belonging. This focus is necessary, but when it remains dominant into later life, it becomes psychologically suffocating. Aging gradually reveals that existence is not sustained by possession, but by participation in something that continues beyond the individual. The sense that one's life is connected to a larger continuity becomes essential for inner stability when the horizon of personal time shortens. Without this responsibility, old age often collapses inward. The individual becomes preoccupied with loss, health, and memory, circling endlessly around what is fading. This inward spiral intensifies anxiety and magnifies fear of disappearance. Responsibility to the future redirects attention outward, not toward control, but toward care. It is the recognition that what one embodies, transmits, and exemplifies matters even when personal reward is no longer possible. This recognition anchors the psyche in meaning rather than survival. Responsibility to the future is not limited to biological lineage. Even those without children carry influence forward through values, attitudes, and presence. Every interaction becomes symbolic. How one speaks, listens, forgives, or remains silent shapes the psychological environment of those who come after. The elder who understands this does not withdraw in bitterness or demand reverence. They become attentive to the weight of their example. Their behavior is no longer about self-expression alone, but about what it reinforces in the collective psyche. This responsibility also reshapes the experience of mortality. When life is viewed as a closed circle ending in personal extinction, death becomes unbearable. When life is understood as a link in an ongoing chain, death becomes a transition rather than an erasure. The psyche does not cling as desperately to permanence because it experiences continuity symbolically. Meaning is no longer confined to the individual lifespan. This symbolic continuity calms existential fear and allows the individual to face finitude with greater composure. The absence of responsibility to the future often manifests as cynicism. The individual dismisses younger generations, devalues change, and clings rigidly to the past. This attitude is not wisdom, it is despair disguised as superiority. Responsibility to the future dissolves this bitterness by restoring purpose. The elder no longer competes with the new or condemns it. They recognize that renewal is necessary and that their role is not to dominate it, but to orient it. This orientation may occur through guidance, restraint, or quiet example rather than instruction. Memory itself changes under this pillar. Instead of being hoarded as personal property, memory becomes a resource to be shared selectively and responsibly. The individual no longer recounts the past to assert relevance, but to offer insight. Stories are told not to impress, but to illuminate patterns, consequences, and meaning. This selective transmission strengthens the bond between generations and gives the elder a sense of usefulness that does not depend on productivity. Responsibility to the future also alters how regret is held. Regret can either paralyze or instruct. When the psyche sees no future beyond itself, regret becomes heavy and personal. When the psyche is oriented toward continuity, regret transforms into wisdom. Past mistakes become warnings rather than wounds. The individual seeks to prevent repetition rather than demand forgiveness. This redirection of regret protects the psyche from stagnation and turns suffering into contribution. This pillar deepens ethical awareness. Actions are no longer evaluated solely by immediate outcomes, but by their long-term psychological impact. The individual becomes more careful with words, judgments, and attitudes, understanding that these shape unseen futures. This care does not arise from fear but from responsibility. The elder becomes a guardian of meaning, aware that cynicism, cruelty, or despair can spread as easily as hope and integrity. Responsibility to the future also softens the fear of irrelevance. Relevance, when defined by visibility or authority, inevitably fades. When defined by influence on meaning, it remains intact. The individual may no longer lead institutions or make decisions, but their way of being continues to resonate. A calm presence, a measured response, a refusal to surrender to bitterness. These are forms of influence that operate quietly but persistently. There is also a reconciliation with time that occurs under this pillar. Time is no longer experienced as a countdown, but as a process. The individual becomes less preoccupied with how much remains and more attentive to how what remains is lived. Each moment becomes an opportunity to reinforce values rather than accumulate experiences. This shift reduces anxiety and brings clarity. The future is not something to reach, but something to support. Responsibility to the future requires humility because it demands releasing ownership over outcomes. One plants without knowing who will harvest. This uncertainty is difficult for a psyche accustomed to control, yet it is precisely this uncertainty that frees the individual from desperation. Meaning no longer depends on recognition. It depends on sincerity. The individual acts in alignment with what they believe should endure, regardless of whether they witness its continuation. In this way, old age becomes generative rather than terminal. The psyche does not shrink with the body, it expands symbolically. Attention moves from preservation of the self to preservation of meaning. This movement restores vitality of a different kind, one not measured by energy or speed, but by depth and coherence. The individual feels connected to the unfolding of life rather than isolated at its edge, and this connection allows them to inhabit their later years with purpose, steadiness, and inner orientation toward what continues beyond their own existence.